Hi, good morning, grade 5. This is Teacher Joy, and today we are going to read the story 73, A Self Made Man. Are you ready to listen? Okay, let's start. Who was the father of his country? I know what you will say, George Washington. But there was another man called the father of his country before Washington was born, and he was not an American. In the northeast of Europe and in northern Asia, there is a great country twice as large as our own. Its name is Russia. Very little had been heard of Russia before the year 1700. For although it was the largest country in Europe, its people were relatively isolated, that is, living apart from the rest of Europe. The Russians were a branch of large Indo-European family called Slavs. Genghis Khan and the Mongols had conquered Russia in the 13th century and ruled over the land. So, although the Russians were Christians, they were in some ways more like the people of the East than like Europeans. The men had long beards and wore long coats. The people counted on an abacus as the Chinese did. Long after serfdom had ended in Western Europe, a great many Russians still were serfs. Well, just before 1700s, there was born a Russian prince named Peter. When a small boy, Peter was very much afraid of the water. But he felt so ashamed that he, a prince, should fear anything that he forced himself to get used to the water. He would go to it and play in it and sail boats on it, although all the time he was almost scared to death. At the last, he not only got over this great fear, but he came to like the water and boats more than any other playthings. When Peter grew up, the thing he wanted more than anything else in the world was to make his country important in Europe. For before this time, it had not been. It was big but not great. He wanted his people to share the culture and wealth that other Europeans enjoyed. But before he could teach his own people, most of whom were very poor and ignorant, he had to learn himself. As there was no one in Russia who would teach him what he wanted to know, he disguised himself as a common laborer and went to the little country of Holland. Here he got a good job. He got a job in shipbuilding yard and worked for several months, cooking his own food and mending his own clothes. While he was doing this, however, he learned all about building ships and studied many other things besides, such as blacksmithing, cobbling shoes, and even pulling teeth. Then he went to England, and everywhere he went, he learned all he could. At last, he returned to his own country with the knowledge he had gained and set to work to make Russia over. First of all, Peter wanted Russia to have a fleet of ships as other nations had. But in order to have a fleet, he had to have water for his ships, and Russia had almost no land bordering on the water. So Peter planned to take seashore away from the neighboring country of Sweden. Now, the king of Sweden at this time was Charles. He was the 12th king named Charles then that Sweden had had. Charles the 12th was hardly more than a boy, and Peter thought it would be an easy matter to beat his boy and help himself to whatever land he wanted on the water. But Charles was not an ordinary boy. He was an extraordinary boy, extraordinarily bright and gifted, and he had been unusually well educated besides. He knew several languages. He had learned to ride a horse when he was 4 years old and how to hunt and to fight. Besides all this, he feared neither hardships nor danger. Indeed, he was such a daredevil that people called him the madman of the north. At first, Peter's army was beaten by Charles. But Peter took his beating calmly, simply remarking that Charles would soon teach the Russian army how to win. Indeed, so successful was Charles at first in fighting Peter and all others who threatened him that the country of Europe began to think of him as Alexander the Great come to life again, and they feared he might conquer them all. But at last, the Russians did win against Charles, and Peter got his seashore. Peter then built the fleet for which he had been working and planning for so many years. The capital of Russia was Moscow. It was a beautiful city, but near the center of the country and far from the water. This didn't suit Peter at all. Peter wanted a fine city for his capital, but he wanted it right on the water's edge so that he could have his beloved ships close to him. He picked out a spot not only on the water but mostly water, for it was chiefly a marsh. Then he put 1/3 of a million people to work filling in the marsh. And on this he built a beautiful city. This city he called St. Petersburg in honor of his patron saint, the Apostle Peter, after whom he himself had been named. The name of St. Petersburg, was later changed to Petrograd and still later to Leningrad, and now it is again called St. Petersburg. After a revolution, which you will read about later, the capital was moved back to Moscow. Peter improved the laws, started schools, and built factories and hospitals, and taught his people arithmetic. He made his people dress like other Europeans. He made the men cut off their long beards, which he thought looked countrified. The men thought it indecent to have no beards, so some saved them to be placed in their coffins in order that at the day of resurrection they could appear before God unashamed. He introduced all sorts of things that he found in Europe, but which were unknown in his own country. And he really made Russia over into a great European nation. That is why he is called Peter the Great, the father of his country. Peter fell in love with a poor peasant girl, an orphan named Catherine, and married her. She had no education, but she was very sweet and lovely and bright and quick-witted, so the marriage turned out happily. The Russians were shocked at the idea of having a queen who was not a princess and was so low-born. But Peter had her crowned, and after he died, she ruled over Russia. So, guys, this is the end of the story. A self-made man. I hope you understood the story. So, meaning to say, the person that they called the father of his country was Peter, the Peter the Great. So, if you didn't understand anything, please inbox me so I can discuss it to you again. And later, I'm going to send you the questions for this story. Okay, I hope you understood. Until next time, grade 5. Bye.